Hello out there. Welcome to GreenGrowth CPAs Cannabis Wholesale Market Price Update. This is a recurring series where we take a look at wholesale prices and general market trends in the cannabis industry throughout the U.S. with our friends at Cannabis Benchmarks. And I'm your host, Chris Lenz. I'm CMO at GreenGrowth CPAs, the leading cannabis accounting advisory firm in the U.S. And joining me, as always, is Adam Koh, editorial director at Cannabis Benchmarks. Here he comes. Hello, Adam. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate you having me back here.
Absolutely. So before we dive in, tell us a little bit about Cannabis Benchmarks and where we're getting the data we're going to be talking about today.
Sure. So Cannabis Benchmarks, we were founded in 2015 to be an independent price reporting agency for legal cannabis markets. So we collect transaction data on wholesale flower prices and other products from legal cannabis businesses, industry groups, operators in the market, and we assess wholesale flower prices for 18 different states. Currently working on expanding to cover more as legalization progresses. And we have what we call our price contributor network that's feeding us the data each week. We see thousands of pounds worth of transactions from those states every week and publish state level price assessments as well as our US spot index, which is sort of an aggregate wholesale price for the country.
Great. And we have this partnership because in helping cannabis operators throughout the country maximize revenue and profits, we rely a lot on this trusted third-party information about, what prices are and how to affect pricing and inventory management strategies and so on. So let's dive in. Let's talk big picture at first. So what are we looking at overall trends in wholesale flower prices from the last month?
Sure. So for October, our U.S. spot index averaged $1,419 per pound, and that's down about 4% from September. So, for those viewers who were here last month or watched the previous recording, we mentioned that the national wholesale price has been in a downtrend recently. That continued into October, and we're actually seeing, prices sort of fall below where they were pre-pandemic. So in the final week of October, the U.S. spot fell below $1,400 per pound for the first time since June 2020. And as a whole, October 2021's average price was down a whole 14% compared to October a year ago. So a pretty big decrease there.
Wow. So let's talk about some of the conditions that are causing this. We know we discussed oversupply last month in some detail. Same trend continuing?
Yeah, it's in the West Coast states. We talked last month a lot about California and Oregon. There's an oversupply out there. It's a combo of a good amount of inventory left over from a big harvest in 2020, and then also expanded harvests this summer, particularly from light deprivation growers. We continued to see prices in California and Oregon trend downward in October, so no change there. And, we can talk about this a little towards the end, but early indicators are that this year's outdoor harvest might be quite a bit bigger than last year's even. So, could be seeing another big surge of supply hit the market in the coming months out west. But we should also mention Colorado. We didn't really talk about Colorado last month, the second biggest market in the country to California. Prices have been sliding there as well. And so in October 21, the average spot price for the state of Colorado on its own was down 30% compared to a year ago. So a really big slide, and sort of similar to the West Coast. Basically, we're seeing overproduction compared to demand. The Marijuana Enforcement Division of Colorado, they recently released some updated data for 2020, And it shows that even though consumers and patients purchased 583,000 pounds of cannabis flower in 2020, which is a ridiculous number, growers actually produced over 800,000 pounds. So production outpaced demand by about 40% in 2020. And you can see sort of how the wholesale prices responded accordingly. But yeah, Colorado also is sort of representative of a bigger picture national trend that we've been seeing, which is declining demand and slowing sales. And so the most recent sales data we have for Colorado is from August. They have a little lag in their reporting, but in August, total adult use and medical cannabis sales in Colorado reached $192 million. And, you know, obviously a very big number there, but it's actually down 12% compared to August 2020. And so last year we saw sales in Colorado peak in July. Looks like probably the same this year. We're expecting that sales will continue to sort of trend downward, and you know, we might see a little bit of a pop in December to close the year, but otherwise it seems like they're still lagging, like we've seen in a lot of other markets nationally. So even the newer adult use systems like Illinois and Michigan, where we were seeing really rapid growth earlier this year, they've sort of leveled off at around 120 million or so monthly the past several months in those states. But it's not too atypical. What we've seen over the years from watching these markets is September through November is usually one of the slowest sales periods of the year. So, you know, it's going to be like that through the winter, and then usually in the spring we'll see things pick back up again.
Yeah, fingers crossed for sure. It's interesting that so many of the well-established markets are the ones enduring, seems like, the biggest oversupply and other issues. Is that a fair assessment? You know, between California, Colorado, and Oregon, we're seeing the biggest issues.
Yeah, that I would say that's definitely a fair assessment. You know, the newer ones, like Michigan and Illinois. Well, we're starting to see Michigan as the market develops, they're handing out more licenses. We talked a little bit about that last month. So we're starting to see in Michigan some surplus supply building up, particularly on the medical side. The adult use side still pretty well balanced. But yeah, states like Illinois are very different from the West Coast. There's no outdoor growing. There's only about 20 producers that are supplying the market in Illinois, and also, you know, in other East Coast states, the licenses are more limited. So you don't have those big oversupply situations like we're seeing out west right now.
Yeah, and I know here in California, we're still really struggling with getting more municipalities to allow sales to occur and create more dispensaries, because we've got the market demand for it, but there's just not an outlet. So, you know, we're giving out the growing licenses, and the growers are getting better and better and better, increasing the amount, but we're not getting the same level of new retail outlets opening.
Exactly. Yeah, it needs that retail expansion just so the product has somewhere to go.
Yep. We got a great question here from the audience, from Ray Davis. Thank you. He says, can you provide any insight on the price variance on spot sales between indoor and outdoor?
Yeah, absolutely. So this time of year, probably no surprise to people that are familiar with cannabis markets, the overall price decline is really being driven a lot by a downtrend in outdoor product prices. And so because at Cannabis Benchmarks, we calculate a volume weighted average price for each state and for the country. We feel that's more accurate. It gives equal weight to every pound that we see traded. And since there's just so much more outdoor product coming to market this time of year, that sort of has an outsized effect on the national price. But yeah, I mean, in a market like California, you know, we're seeing indoor product traded at just under 1,600 per pound on average versus outdoor at below 800. So, indoor has a premium of essentially roughly double outdoor in California. That's the biggest spread we see, but there are, significant spreads in the other, the three major Western states that have outdoor growing in addition to California, Oregon, Washington, Colorado. It's all those markets. There's at least about a $500-$600 difference per pound between indoor and outdoor. So it's pretty significant.
So we've identified the outdoor is really dragging down the whole market look, but is there if you isolate the indoor, is that price declining as well at the same rates, similar rates?
It has been pulling downward, not at the same pace as the outdoor flower, and it probably won't because sort of like I alluded to, you have this year's harvest coming in now as well. It's probably still mostly being dried, tested, packaged up, and things like that. So it's not yet hit the market in full force. But yeah, I mean, what we've seen in the past when there are these sort of periods of big oversupply is that prices in general, the ranges between the lows and the highs generally compress because you just have so much product out there. It can be hard for sellers to differentiate themselves in the market. A buyer can just say, hey, I'll go to the next, person. There's so much available. So, we've seen that in the past. I can't say for sure that it'll happen, but if those, historical trends hold, we might see sort of the price ranges, the differences within grow types and between grow types sort of compress if the oversupply is as big as it's looking like it is.
Yeah, very true. We got another question from Stephen Walzer. We've been talking about indoor prices. Do you split it then between greenhouse as well? And then do we track that difference? How is greenhouse performing compared to the other indoor?
Yeah, absolutely. Cannabis Benchmarks, we do report greenhouse specific prices for several markets. Greenhouse is a little dicey. It can be a wide range because there's really, there's a wide variety of greenhouses. There's people growing in very simple, rudimentary, like hoop house type setups where it's really just tarp over, a skeleton frame. And there's, rigid greenhouses that are very high tech, very well equipped. So, the price can range quite a bit. So you have some greenhouse product that we see that is, mixed light production that sells closer to the rates we see for outdoor. But then in some states, and Colorado is actually a good example of this in general, a lot of the greenhouses in Colorado are sort of those rigid structures that are pretty well climate controlled. And so you can get a good quality flower out of that. And in Colorado, we have frequently seen, and this is the case now as well, we've frequently seen indoor and greenhouse wholesale flower prices tracking quite closely.
Yeah, cool, great, thank you. What else? What any other trends are we seeing in wholesale prices in legal markets these days?
Yeah, sure. So a market we did not talk about last month is Arizona, and that's actually the newest adult use market where sales are actually happening. Adult use sales began early this year in late January. And so, while we've seen many of the other states out west in this downward price slide, in Arizona, since the midsummer, we've seen prices generally on the rise. They sort of leveled off in October around $18.50 per pound, but that's actually up 30% compared to October 2020. So, whereas in Colorado you saw that 30% decline, Arizona you have that 30% uptick. And they were actually even higher earlier this year around April. They topped $2,000 a pound for the first time in a long time. But
Wow.
Price volatility is pretty typical, like I said, with adult use sales starting fairly recently there.
Yeah. So what are the market factors that are driving this increased demand and price going up?
Sure. So yeah, Arizona had sort of a funny start to adult use sales. I mean, I think, people watching the markets right now, if you look at a state like New York, they just announced they're not going to issue adult use licenses till 2023. It's this very long wait. Arizona was the opposite. Businesses were actually caught off guard by how quickly the adult use sales started. So, voters approved the adult use legalization measure in Arizona in the November 2020 elections. It was sort of generally expected that sales would begin around March or April this year, which is really quite fast in itself. But the state agencies there processed the applications, I mean, in a flash, basically, and sales started up in late January. So just pretty much like 2 months after the election, which is really unheard of. Um, it helped, like I said, there was that early year price rise, and that's really because of that quick start. The businesses there, the medical businesses, even though it was a big, well-established medical program, they still needed time to expand their production, and so that's what was happening sort of earlier this year with the price rise. They seem to have sort of caught up to demand around the summer, and prices have begun to are down from earlier this year and have begun to sort of level off. And I guess the final factor in that is sales haven't been quite as strong as I think some may have expected. We just mentioned states like Michigan and Illinois where they're seeing over 120 million just on the adult use side for sales each month recently. In Arizona, after the initial sort of January, February ramp up, adult use sales have been pretty consistent, around 54, 59 million each month from March through August. And they've yet to surpass the medical sales. So the medical side there in Arizona is still the larger side of the market. We've been seeing around 61 to 73 million each month, but that has been sort of sliding from earlier this year to now, whereas the adult use side, even though it's been pretty consistent, has been generally getting closer.
Yeah, that is surprising because usually we see, as soon as the rec comes online, that the medical drops pretty
Mhm.
significantly, but it's holding on quite strong there. Is that, are you hearing reports that, the adult use dispensaries and so on and retailers are a little bit slower to get online, or any
Well,
sense of what's slowing that?
yeah, well, it's in Arizona. It's pretty much the same businesses right now. They haven't had. They do have. They're working on a social equity program that'll issue some more licenses to expand the market a little bit. That hasn't happened yet. So at the moment, it's really just the same businesses that had been in the medical market. And I think what part of the reason is that the medical market in Arizona was so big and robust that it was, I mean, effectively capturing a lot of adult use demand anyway. We've watched that market for a long time, and you would see the sales spike on weekends, holidays, like July 4th, 420, of course, the Super Bowl. It had patterns that made it look perhaps a little recreational even before there was recreational there. So I think a lot of the consumers, maybe already have medical cards, and perhaps as those start to lapse, there might not be a reason to renew if you can just go and buy as an adult use consumer rather than paying the money for a doctor's recommendation and the medical registration fee. So we might see that it might be a little delayed, the adult use sort of ramp up there.
Yeah, absolutely. What about any other Western states that we're seeing sort of similar trends where prices are not plunging and either holding strong or growing.
hmm Yeah. So another state that we did not touch on last month is Nevada. And that's another one, along with Arizona, where prices, wholesale prices, are up compared to 2020. In October, we saw Nevada's state spot index average around $2,000 per pound, so pretty robust price for out west there. And it's been pretty steady the past few months, and that 2,000 per pound level is up about 25% from where it was a year ago. So another pretty big increase.
Wow. And I imagine there's going to be looking back, a big surge over MJ BizCon weekend. I bet local sales really surged in Vegas. What
Mhm.
else is happening in Nevada that's driving this?
Yeah, well, I mean, you sort of alluded to, one of the major characteristics of Nevada's market right there with the tourism, the visitors for conventions and just, recreational purposes. It's a low population state, but it just sees a huge amount of tourists. So it's a kind of an outlier nationally. We don't see the same sales trends in Nevada month to month that we see in most other states. And the large amount of tourism there also means that Nevada's market was hit very hard by the pandemic last year. So while we've talked about how there was sort of a pandemic boom in sales, initially at least that was not the case in Nevada. So normally you have about 3.5 million tourists visiting Vegas monthly on average. That went down to almost nothing in the early months of the pandemic last year. In April and May 2020, you had about 100,000. So 150,000 tourists, so down over 90 something percent. But something that was very interesting is, while other states saw this sort of pandemic sales boom early on in the spring and the summer, it was delayed in Nevada, but it arrived. We actually saw sales start to increase really significantly even before tourists came back. So that indicates that the local demand from the in-state residents really grew substantially during the pandemic. And just to put some numbers on that, we saw, prior to the pandemic in January, February 2020, sales were around 60 million a month in Nevada. They dropped down to just about 40 million in March and April 2020, the first couple months where we started to see, lockdowns and restrictions and things like that. But then they started to climb, and they actually hit 80 million. They topped $80 million for the first time in the history of Nevada's market in October 2020. And the state set that sales record, even though there were only about half the amount of tourists visiting Las Vegas that month as there would have normally been without the pandemic. And so, unsurprisingly, the flower prices were sort of on a roller coaster in Nevada last year as well. They fell from February through September 2020, while sales were kind of depressed and things were starting to come back. And then they were on the rise when sales started to pick up in the fourth quarter last year. And things have been pretty. It's interesting, even with all the turmoil there, like I mentioned, with the ebb and the flow of the tourist market. Wholesale prices have been pretty stable this year in Nevada, and sales have been pretty consistent as well. We have data from up to July this year, but they've been running at around 95 million a month on average from March through July. So it's really bounced back and at a significantly higher level than it was last year. So that's helped push the wholesale prices up there.
Oh, that's great. So why is there the seeming disconnect? You'd think the number of tourists would be a direct correlation to rising sales prices, but that's not really, exactly what we're seeing.
Right. Yeah, it is interesting. It's hard to put an exact pin on it, but we do believe the increase in the local demand is, you know, that we think that's making up a larger bulk of sales right now. And we really think that's due to the pandemic. One of the reasons we think sales increased across the board last year is people who might have been, cannabis consumers who were obtaining their product from unlicensed sources, who maybe still had a guy or a woman who they were getting it from. We think that they shifted into buying from stores or licensed stores, legal stores, or delivery services where those are available. It's a safer alternative. Stores were enforcing mask wearing, they were enforcing social distancing, how many people were allowed in at any one time. And a lot of states made some allowances like curbside product pickup or online ordering to make things more convenient. So, while the pandemic was obviously very tough on a lot of industries, we think that was part of the reason it actually sort of helped the legal cannabis industry capture maybe some consumers that weren't going there before for their product. And it seems like that trend has held in Nevada. And while there's no hard data, unfortunately, Nevada is not one of the states that separates out in-state from out-of-state purchases. I would guess that if you looked at it now compared to pre-pandemic, in-state purchasers make up a larger proportion of sales there than they did before.
Yeah, that's great. Those actual shifts in consumer behaviors are longer lasting and have a lot more potential. So that's great to hear. And yeah, it was a lot safer to go to the dispensary than it was to stop at your plug's house during the pandemic. So
Absolutely.
I guess it makes sense. We got another question from Stephen here. What is currently the highest price state per pound? And then if you have it available, what are the top couple right now? Where are we standing?
So right now, Illinois is the runaway highest state. We mentioned last month that it was tracking above $4,100 a pound, and that's held. I don't really see too much of a reason why it'd change in the near future. So yeah, Illinois is up there. And the other ones that are quite high in terms of recreational markets are Massachusetts and Alaska. So Alaska all the way up there. It's a small market compared to many of the ones down in the continental US, but they have, I'm sure you guys know at GreenGrowth, but for some of the viewers, they have very high taxes in Alaska. Every pound of flower traded has a flat $800 per pound tax on it, no matter what the price. So obviously the growers there have to inflate the price a little bit to make something for themselves. Massachusetts, we're seeing prices there above $3,500 a pound. So still very elevated compared to the Western states, and that's a market where we talked a little more detail last month, but just in general, they've seen really strong sales growth since the second half of last year, and it's continued into this year. They're starting to see more businesses come online, but there's still only about 60 growers that are actually operating in Massachusetts, compared to in some of the Western states, you have several hundred or several thousand. So yeah, Illinois, Massachusetts, Alaska, those are the top states for the most expensive wholesale prices.
Wow, cool, thank you. And then you got a couple minutes left here. Anything else notable that we want to just let the viewers know about?
Yeah, so something we've been watching is sort of bigger picture than just legal cannabis. We're sort of keeping an eye on purchasing habits in light of just the broader economic landscape as we come out of this pandemic. I'm sure everyone's heard or felt the supply chain difficulties, things that you're ordering taking longer to get there, all over the place. And something we've been keeping an eye on in our weekly reports is the Consumer Price Index, and that measures the change in prices paid by consumers for goods and services. So that has been on the rise. In September, it was up 5% compared to the year before. And so in many areas of the country, you have prices for basic necessities, rent, food, utilities, gas, are going up. I know I'm feeling the pain when I fill up my truck, unfortunately. So, but
Real quick, what's the gas? Do you know roughly where you are per
um,
gallon?
well, so for the good stuff that the truck needs, it's up over $4 a gallon here in Colorado, which is, yeah, it's quite a bit higher than last year at this time. I think I could fill my tank for less than $50 last year. It's like $70 now. So not fun.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, things like that can squeeze discretionary spending on items like cannabis. And even though last year with the sales boom during the pandemic, people sort of said, hey, maybe cannabis is this recession-proof commodity like alcohol has been shown to be. But last year you had the federal government providing things like the stimulus checks that many people got, enhanced unemployment for people that were out of work due to COVID, rent relief. There were all these programs going on last year that gave people a little bit of a cushion that are really pretty much entirely gone now. And then another thing that I think people might forget is with all the lockdowns and the business closures last year, people just didn't have a place to spend money, right? I mean, you couldn't go to a ball game, you couldn't go to a concert or movie, what have you. So people just had more disposable income. Perhaps that's part of the reason for that cannabis pandemic sales boom that we saw. And so, a lot of that has been retained. The sales now are still higher than they were 2 years ago. But in the mature markets, we're seeing, the sales drop below levels where they were last year. There's usually a little uptick in demand around the holidays. We'll see how that goes this year, if people have to spend more on traveling, on gifts, things like that. I know I was just looking at flights home to Philadelphia from Colorado, and looks like I might be driving. That might be cheaper. But yeah, anyway, as we've talked about those softening cannabis sales, the falling cannabis sales that we've seen in the past few months have sort of, it's typical of the season, but it's also coincided with these higher consumer prices for everything else. So, it's a little bit of a cliche, but the pandemic's changed a lot of things. We're still sort of feeling the effects of that, and how we're not quite sure how that's going to shake out. But right now it seems just like the production in the western states especially, but also the newer states where younger businesses are ramping up, it seems like the production side has got the upper hand and is really outpacing the sliding sales. And one thing I mentioned early on is this year's harvest. Oregon state officials actually released some data earlier this month, just last week, that shows that outdoor growers in that state harvested about 50% more wet weight this just last month than they did in October 2020. So we already had, 2020 was already a big outdoor harvest where you had products still left over a year later. And then, it looks like this year you didn't have the wildfire pressure that you had last year. And the pandemic disruption wasn't as severe this year. So it looks like the growers out west were able to bring in an even bigger crop. So, that that to me just sort of points to a continuing downtrend in the wholesale prices for the foreseeable future, probably a good bit into next year.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a bit of a perfect storm here brewing between what you're talking about with the rise in costs for just consumer items and in heavily taxed markets like California, where people who are feeling, that pressure are even more likely to potentially go reach out to their black market. And, we're struggling with the black market in so many ways. And
Mhm.
cultivators who are doing their best and trying to go on the path and can't turn a profit, there's always that sort of outlet to it, unfortunately, and we're just never really going to have this full flourishing cannabis industry until those taxes and fees start going down and get to a reasonable space.
Yeah, in Colorado, the taxes are much more favorable than in California, but it's still, in Denver, you have the 15% wholesale tax, you have the 15% state tax. In Denver, there's another 8% or so. So it adds up, and then like you mentioned, yeah, California is even steeper there, and on the grower side, they have the flat tax by weight for cultivators. So even though the price is going down, especially for outdoor growers in California, they're still paying the same tax rate, which is especially tough. So yeah, hopefully they can weather the storm. One positive that could be on the horizon is, we saw a similar period of oversupply and low prices occur sort of from the mid 2016 to 2018 period. And after that, we saw sales grow a good bit in some of these states that were hard hit. So, it again, it's a little bit painful now. I don't want to downplay that for the people that are in the market. It's tough, but hopefully, if prices go lower, it can help to bring more consumers into the market. If retailers lower their prices accordingly, and then, like you mentioned, with changing behaviors, changing trends, if people start patronizing legal licensed stores, it can tend to stick, and hopefully it'll sort of convert more consumers from the illegal market, and help to grow the legal side for the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you were saying, the next 3 months, I think, will be really telling about whether those changes in consumer behaviors will really stick and endure some other market difficulties, some financial difficulties. So, all right. So that is the end of our time here. Thank you so much, Adam. Really appreciate you coming on and sharing your insights. You did great.
All right. Thank you, Chris. No, pleasure to be here. Yeah, and looking forward to the next one.
Great. So, yeah, for our audience, we're doing these every month. It's the second Tuesday of every month. We'll get the next one scheduled right after this. And for anyone who is struggling with operators who are struggling, we did release an article just the other day about strategies for surviving in this environment, and we'll be dropping that video on Thursday. So if you don't already, give us a like and a follow, and you'll see all the latest, and you won't miss our next wholesale price update. So thanks again, Adam. Really appreciate it. And thanks to everyone with their questions and for watching. Cheers.